Good evening, everyone, and Kong Hee Fat Choi to our Asian friends. On behalf of the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Trust, I would like to thank everyone for making the time for coming today, especially because we are right in the middle of term. This debate would not have materialized without the support of the director of the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Trust, Ms. Alexandra Henderson. And the hard work behind the scenes of Alicia, Jane, and fellow Weidenfeld scholars. Coming from 28 different countries, this event represents the ability of cooperation from such a diverse group of people. We decided on this topic, I think basically because it is such a commonality within that diversity that we have this issue about hate speech and free speech. So with Germany as recently as this January having implemented a hate speech law, we find it opportune to debate the issue of free speech. Would regulation protect free speech, or would it instead curtail free speech? That is the question that our learned debaters will persuade you today. So we are also honored to have the presence of the eminent Sir Trevor McDonald, who has graciously accepted our invitation to chair this event today. So with that, I now invite Sir Trevor to say a few words.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. This is always a special event. I like to be in the company of scholars. I haven't had a chance to do that in my life before, so it's very nice. And the work of this trust, the work of Lord Weidenfeld and Andre Hoffmann is really terribly impressive. And if I may say, I envy you all. You are terribly lucky to be part of this, and I hope that this is an experience that you'll take back to your countries eventually and do very well. I'm also very impressed about the subject you've chosen for debate, because it's one which is very live to be discussed, and one which can be probably discussed in many countries around the world at this very time. So with that, let the debate begin.
Thank you, Sir Trevor. I will now briefly explain the debate rules. Debaters, each of you will have 3 minutes to present your case and respond to the argument from the previous debater. I will hit the gavel once to signal that you have 30 seconds left. I will hit the gavel twice to say your time is up, and I will have to ask you to sit down. The proposition team will begin first today, followed immediately by the opposition counterpart. We will break after the second debaters for each team have provided their arguments, and we'll ask the floor for questions. Your questions will be answered by the final debaters from each team. I ask that when you ask your question, please raise your hand. A mic will be making its way towards you, and ask your questions with brevity and clarity. The last debater will then answer these questions. We will then hold a short voting. We will implement the efficient, traditional, low-tech method of raising your hands when I ask whether you vote for what the proposition has said or what the opposition has said. In addition to that, we are also going online. So if you have a Twitter account, follow @WeidenfeldScall. I repeat, @WeidenfeldScall. You can also follow the hashtag WHDDebate2018. Hashtag WHDDebate2018. You can cast 2 votes if you have a Twitter account by voting on the Twitter poll, as well as raising your hand in this hall. Mr. Charlie Paul, as the first debater for the proposition team, will introduce all of his fellow debaters today. Famously known as the first and only Nigerian kite surfer, Charlie is no stranger to adventure. He will surely set the stage for a robust and lively debate. With that, Sir Trevor, shall we begin?
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Paul, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. It falls on me this evening to introduce my fellow debaters, and I do that with great pleasure. Besides myself, for the proposition, we have Sadia Gardezi, who's a journalist, a political cartoonist, and an artist from Pakistan. She's studying for a master's in South Asian Studies here at the University of Oxford. Following her, we have Pratik Datta, who before coming to Oxford was a lawyer that worked with the Indian government to implement reforms in the financial sector, and is studying for a master's in law and finance here at the University of Oxford. And first for the opposition, we have Claudia Coglioni, who's a strong, independent woman, a global citizen, and a former environmental manager from Brazil, who's studying for a master's in water science, policy, and management here at Oxford. Sir Trevor, ladies and gentlemen, I must inform you we have another celebrity in our midst. Sarthak Agarwal was a sensation in India for scoring the highest score ever at the Indian school leavers examination. They are literally memes dedicated to this young man. Besides that, he's produced award-winning work, and he's studying for a master's in economics here at the University of Oxford. Finally, for the opposition, we have Femia Yegusi, a former banker and bodybuilder, an aspiring social entrepreneur. In his spare time, he kind of moonlights as a life coach for myself and some of the other scholars, and like myself, is studying for a Master's of Business Administration. Femi, namaste. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. These are your debaters, Sir Chairman. First things first, we must make it absolutely clear that this debate centers around hate speech and not hate crimes. Those are fundamentally different things. This discussion is not about something that is synonymous to libel or slander or incitement to commit violence. This debate centers around the permissibility of the expression of an emotion that is a fundamental part of being human, a fundamental part of sentience, of the consciousness that makes us who and what we are. And denying the expression of this emotion permissibility would be denying this fundamental part of ourselves. It would be limiting our own humanities and handicapping our own democracies. Each and every one of us reserve the right to think and to speak freely. My single argument today is simple, and that is that disruptive, offensive, and even hateful expressions have been central to some of the most significant changes in modern society. I don't think anyone in this room can deny the importance of freedom of expression. But aren't the true benefits of free speech realized when the right is allowed to be exercised to its extremes? Because ultimately, it is the permission of controversial and even disdainful opinions that allows freedom of expression to fulfill its most essential roles in modern society. The assurance that there are checks on powers, and the allowance for each and every one of us to speak candidly about how we feel about the world around us. Please do not let my dear friends across the table convince you that in an attempt to protect the personal and emotional safety of ourselves and those around us, that we should limit the rights of others to freedom of expression. Please do not let them convince you that we should perpetuate the same censorship we condemn in North Korea and China and Zimbabwe and Burma, because in this particular instance, it protects sensitivities in our societies. I cannot and I will not speak for any one of you, but I would rather live in an honest society where issues are dealt with than in a dishonest society where people with unpopular opinions are silenced. Because what if I have that unpopular opinion? What if you have that unpopular opinion? The truth is that there's a price to pay for living in an open and free society. And that price is that sometimes you'll see things and you'll hear things that you don't particularly like. But that is when you discuss. That is when you debate. That is when you enlighten, or you are enlightened. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I would have it any other way. Thank you.
I will never forget the first time I heard Mr. Jair Bolsonaro, an influential Brazilian congressman, express his opinion on LGBT community. With no hesitation or shame, he openly said, "I believe that gay sons, they exist because their parents didn't beat up very much, and because I'd rather have a dead son over a gay son." Now, this gentleman is a former military, and he's been rising the political polls for the Brazilian election this year. This is even more concerning in a country that has shifted from dictatorship to democracy only 3 decades ago, and where an LGBT person is murdered or commits suicide every 19 hours, which makes Brazil the leading country in crimes with sexual minorities. The proposition might want you to think that this is an isolated case, this is not harmful enough, and that hate speech is free speech. But let me get this message very clear. This is not an isolated case, and hate speech is not free speech. And I'll give 2 major arguments to set the scene for what hate speech really is. Firstly, hate speech, whether verbally or written, silences and threatens minorities, particularly based on race, religion, and sexuality. Those who propagate hate speech as free speech believe to have the absolute right of oppressing, regardless of consequences. If we allow that to flourish, we will create a very unsafe environment, particularly to minorities. Hate speech would lead to an imbalance of power in such a way that the one who gets heard is the one who talks louder. Secondly, hate speech weakens democracy and encourages violence. Because hate speech is loud, it undermines democracy and makes you think that's the voice of the majority. And this is dangerous because hate speech stimulates hate. This is a direct threat to people's freedom because you can also deepen segregation when that's already into place. If you do not fit into this framework of hate speech, let me tell you, you're actually suffering from it. And in addition, alternative voices will not be empowered. I have no doubts that at this very moment in my home country, there are several ads praising Mr. Bolsonaro, painted with the yellow and green colors of the Brazilian flag, followed by a loud popular chant of, "You'd better get used to it." My response to them and to the proposition tonight is no. We should not get used to hate speech. And I urge you to do the same tonight. Thank you.
Calling free speech hate speech and censoring it is a tool to oppress. Over the years, being taught to avoid talking about politics and religion has led to a lack of understanding of politics and religion. What we should have been taught was how to have a civil conversation about a difficult topic. We argue that hate speech is free speech, and we understand that we are arguing for the right of hate speech for the egotistical alternate right-winger who luxuriates in his libertarian ramblings that hurt oppressed groups, because we want to give those oppressed groups that same right. To the black man, to the veiled woman, to the rape victim, to the detained immigrant, to the Kashmiri, to the Palestinian, to the Syrian, to the Rohingya. There is a rage against the system in these countries that silences hate speech, or what can often also be an argument against authoritarianism, like repealing Pakistan's blasphemy laws. The system protects its own right to hate and calls it religion and law. When progressive thinkers agree that offensive words should be censored, it helps authoritarian regimes justify their much harsher restrictions. Hate can be resisted when it is visible. We want to hear out the racist and the homophobe and the anti-immigrant so that we can resist with at least peaceful debate, and at the worst, with hate as resistance. The idea is spread that people have a right not to be offended. But offense is subjective, and the power to police it is both vast and arbitrary. Many believe that someone should have this power, but who are you going to give that power to? Do you ban anti-Semitism? What will you do when it is demanded that Islamophobia be banned? What will you do when it is demanded that climate change activism be silenced? That because a vast majority of sexism comes from men, that men be silenced? In the US and much of the West, a very shallow idea of free speech is wielded by those who are in power. And this is used to direct attention away from critiques of capitalism, of imperialism, of white supremacy, of patriarchy. These are the debates that are being censored and that we are being distracted from. Pro-Palestine protests may soon be banned in the US as being anti-Semitic. Does the opposition really want to endorse such a subjective idea of free speech? Yes, hate can incite violence, but violence is illegal. Laws punishing violence exist and they must. Laws punishing wagging tongues are arbitrary. The opposition will argue that hate on social media causes violence, but the solution doesn't have to be censorship. Maybe something like ending online anonymity may be the solution. The opposition will argue that hate crime has risen this decade, but has it ever really fallen? Is it not true that we have better means to report and track hate crime and then call it out and talk about it in these spaces? Saying hate speech is free speech means we are saying that saying hate speech is not free speech means we are afraid of the racist and bigot. No one has to hide what they feel, and no one has to become victim to a subjective notion of free speech. Not the activists protesting
Ms.
against
Ghazali,
police
your time
action
is
in
up.
America, and not the atheist blogger in Bangladesh.
Hello. Yeah, so at the outset, I'd like to say that it's usually very hard to start speaking after Charlie and Sadia have spoken because they are wonderful speakers. But today it's all the more hard because I'm the rebuttal speaker, and I don't know where to start from contradicting the arguments. They were so flawed that I don't know actually which argument to start from. So what I'll do is I've tried to lump together the arguments into two broad sets, which I'm sure they'll agree are their strongest points. The first one, Charlie very eloquently pointed out about the freedom of expression and how it's the Western liberal idea of free speech. How are we restricting that through restricting hate speech? But I'd like to ask you something. We spoke about in the beginning that what hate speech is actually doing is restricting the right of minorities for free speech. It is actually a poisonous ideal which doesn't allow, whose purpose is just to make sure that the religious minorities, sexual minorities can't get a voice. And when you allow hate speech, you're actually kind of restricting this right to free speech. So where does that progress come from? And secondly, talking more broadly about progress, what progress do we get if Donald Trump says all Mexicans are rapists? Is this kind of society we are building? Is this leading to progress? That's what I ask you all tonight. You also spoke about hate being a fundamental right, but we also know that rights have limits. And the conception of law should rest on the fact that what kind of society do we want to build? Now, coming to the second argument, which was mostly about subjectivity and the slippery slope kind of stuff, the definition we raised is very clear. Hate speech is any kind of attack on the minorities which limits the right to free speech. I don't understand where this is subjective. You gave all sorts of examples which were nowhere hate speech. I suggest that you clarify your stand on what hate speech means, and probably you can look up at sources as well. So, and the slippery slope argument. 500 years back, when somebody thought about democracy, they obviously had in mind that this system could go wrong. But again, they went ahead with it because they realized that this is something which is important. The same is with hate speech as well. If you realize this is important, you have to institute adequate safeguards and make sure that's not exploited. You gave examples of countries where it can be exploited, but tell me in the UK, in the US, which have strong legal systems, do you think that's a problem? No. Now, coming to a few constructive arguments from our side, Claudia outlined the philosophical reasons why hate speech should not be free speech. I'll be putting forth simply 2 points to argue why hate speech should not be free speech in 2018. One thing we realize today is that our world is extremely polarized. In the light of this polarization, what will allowing hate speech to be free speech do? It will give license to all the opportunists to kind of exploit the society even further and gain from that, which is what we're seeing happening in the past couple of years. And my second point over here is that in today's hyper-connected world, with social media actually reaching all aspects of our life, one kind of hate can only spread. And also we know about echo chambers. So if you are hateful to a particular group of people, you will almost have an infinite supply of hateful comments against them every morning in your Facebook newsfeed. I don't imagine that can lead to a more or a less polarized society. Thank you. That's my arguments.
Now I invite the audience to ask questions. Please keep your questions clear and concise. Please raise your hand and a mic will come to you.
I'd just like to ask, who arbitrates what is hate speech?
The question was, what is hate speech? Who determines what is hate speech? Can I ask for another question? Anyone?
Thank you. So there was a point from the proposition about debating people who are hateful and sort of propagate hate speech. Do you think every person who espouses hate speech is capable of being reasoned with and debated in, a sort of normal, sensible way?
The proposition also talked about hate speech as a means for a minority to express itself, but they didn't talk about, I'd like to hear their opinion about how the minority could just feel scared to even say something when they hear such hateful things from an overwhelming majority.
Anyone from this side of the room?
Thank you, Liana. My question about free hate speech not being free speech in that it's a freedom of expression. Does it still remain free speech if it leads to killing of not 1, 2, 3 people, but thousands, hundreds and thousands of people? One example being terrorism across the world. I have investigated in my career a few terrorists, many people have. There is overwhelming evidence that none of them turned without a hate speech. I mean, so they turned into that act, into that area after being influenced by some hate speech.
We have room for one more question.
Hi. So I was wondering whether you have any circumstances under which you would consider hate speech acceptable.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Can you outline any circumstance in which you would consider hate speech to be acceptable? And this is a question to the opposition.
Thank you. Mr. Dada, are you ready?
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for those insightful questions. So let me start off by a couple of clarifications. We are not defending hate crime. We are here to defend the right to hate speech, not the substantive content of hate speech. We do not need to agree with the racists, with the misogynists, with the sexists, with any of those radical groups, but we just need to give space to people to speak their mind out. Someone pointed out about killings of people. Killing of one person is a crime, killing of 10 people is a crime, killing of N number of people is a crime. We are not defending that. We are just defending the right to express your opinion, howsoever offensive, distasteful, hateful it might be. However, this does not extend to defending abetment of an offense. Abetment of an offense is a criminal offense, even under the laws today, and we acknowledge that. That has nothing to do with hate speech. My learned friends for the opposition pointed out to some harms caused by hate speech. Essentially, they spoke about two: that hate speech causes emotional distress, that hate speech may cause harm to the minorities. Now, as reasonable people, we all understand that any policy will have some costs and some benefits. We cannot cherry pick some costs and only look at them. We have to understand the merits of the policy too. And as far as the costs are concerned, we do not deny that hate speech can cause emotional distress to the target audience. However, when it comes to minority rights, there are various other tools in law available to protect minority rights. Every constitution provides for protection of minority rights. There's freedom of religious practices provided in all constitutions. There are freedom given to minority to run their own educational institution. We don't see why minorities need to be protected just by creating a ban on hate speech. Now, I've spoken about the costs of hate speech, as the opposition has pointed out. Now let's understand what are the benefits of allowing the right to hate speech, and this is extremely critical. One of the most fundamental ingredients of a sustainable democracy is trust. We need to trust our fellow beings, our political leaders, our doctors, our police, our judiciary, and so on. What makes it particularly difficult for us to trust a stranger in a position of power is that we do not know about their private beliefs and attitudes. We do not know whether they're actually racist, sexist, or xenophobic, unless they express on their own their private attitudes to us, which they will never do unless hate speech is protected. Unless we protect hate speech, we will not get to know what are the prejudicial ideas that different people in society hold. And this is extremely important because we can trust people only when we know that they do not hold any prejudice against us. We can decide whom not to vote for as a Supreme Court judge if we know that that person is a sexist. We will know when not to elect a president if that person is a racist. But for that, we must allow a space for them to express their most private thoughts. That's why we need to legalize hate speech. Now, let me give you a concrete example if all this sounds too theoretical. Let's take the example of James Damore, a Google engineer. Till very recently, he was a Google engineer. While at Google, Damore wrote an internal memo explaining the reasons for gender imbalance in the tech industry. Damore claimed that women are genetically inferior to men and therefore have less presence in the industry. Damore had the audacity to write down such a blatantly sexist opinion because he knew that there is no legal restriction to his right to free speech. But then what happened was that this memo was released to public and Google faced public pressure to sack Damore. Justice was done, and it was done without any restriction on free speech or on hate speech. Ladies and gentlemen, the first step to solving a problem is to acknowledge the problem, not to suppress it, not to hide it, not to conceal it. Similarly, hate speech and intolerance cannot be eliminated by banning hate speech. The only way to eradicate hate is to build trust in society. And to build trust, we must protect hate speech as free speech. Thank you.
So you've asked some questions, you've raised some issues that I think we should address. The first was, who determines what hate speech is? My response to that would be the societies in which we live. Now, the implication of that is that we have the power to define what hate speech is and proscribe it. That goes against what the proposition will have you believe, which is the fact that hate speech is just this ambiguous thing that existed as a concept that exists by itself. We define what it is, and we define it based on what we do not want as a society. The second question had to do with, okay, that was from Shiri, which is that it keeps, people stifled, and that's true. Thanks for making that point for the opposition. Hate speech stops people from expressing their perspectives, and that goes against the grain of what free speech is. I so much like, you almost took the wind out of my sail, but I so much like that you raised the issue of terrorism. We'll go back there in a minute. Now, when is hate speech acceptable? I would say never. When it stops being violent, then it stopped being hate speech, and then it's acceptable. I've got a whole lot of stuff here. I won't be able to go through my material. But I'm just going to summarize by telling a story and showing maybe the human face of what we're talking about. Not so long ago, I was told a story about a little boy who grew up in London. in an affluent neighborhood. And this boy grew up with two labels. He was black and he was Muslim. And every day coming back from the mosque, on Fridays coming back from the mosque, he would often be insulted with people calling him different things. Now, things came to a head when he went to school, and on his desk he saw an etching. And the etching was simply "Black Terrorist." This was a boy who was just about 7 years old. He grew up to be a very introverted, very sad kid. At some point in his teenage years, he disappeared. This boy reappeared a few months later. He was on the news. Guess what? He tried to bomb a plane. He tried to destroy 1,000 lives. Now, I ask you, how important is your right to expression that it should cost 1,000 lives? Maybe even 1 million. Is it worth it? In theory, hate speech might sound like, well, regulation of hate speech might sound like a bad thing. It might sound like it prevents us from enjoying our freedom to say whatever we want to. But what is the intrinsic good in being able to say anything, even if it damages the world we live in? Even if it damages us as people? Think about it. My point to you tonight is simple. If the kind of world we envisage is one in which you and I can coexist as friends in peace, hate speech has no room in it. Hate speech is a cancer. Thank you.
Thank you, Femi. That was very nice storytelling as well. But I also hope the audience will not be too persuaded emotionally and also take in part of what the proposition has also said.
There are two ways of regulating hate speech. Either this discretion is given to the state or to private players. Now let's take the French model. There, hate speech, what is hate speech is determined by the state. And let me give you an example of how this played out in reality. When Sarkozy was the president, a gentleman put up a placard in front of his car saying, "Go back, you jerk." This person was prosecuted for hate speech. The case went all the way up to the European Court of Justice, which obviously held that this was a malicious prosecution. So giving this discretion to the state is extremely problematic because there are lots of scope for abuse. What's the other option? The other option is to give this discretion to the Facebooks and to the Twitters of the world. This is exactly the German model. In Germany, they enforced a law from earlier this year, which is called the NetzZ, where they make it an obligation on social media platforms to take off any so-called hate speech or else face a fine of around 30,000 euros. What is the consequence of this? The consequence of this law is that a BPO employee of Facebook sitting in Bangalore will be deciding on your fundamental right of freedom and speech and expression. Or else an artificial intelligence software, which has been designed by a 23-year-old kid who is an expert in computer science, will determine where your freedom of speech should end. Do we really want this? It is effectively amounting to privatization of the judiciary. It is effectively amounting to delegation of judicial powers to non-state actors. Is this really the way to go? So I completely agree with this question that you raised. It's a very important question, that arbitrating hate speech is a problem. And there's an essential difference between hate speech and a crime. A hate crime is a question of fact. A hate speech is a question of opinion. And there lies a very critical difference. If I punch Shirley, it's not a matter of my opinion. Shirley is hurt, and it's a fact. If I abuse Shirley, it's up to Shirley. He may not feel offended, but he might feel offended. So who decides whether Shirley is offended other than Shirley? And who decides if other than Charlie about who is offended? Do we give it to Facebook, this discretion, or do we give it to the state? Therefore, in my opinion, this is the main reason why hate crime can be regulated, but not hate speech. Thank you.
I was just wondering, exactly where do we draw the line with hate speech, though? Because if we say that hate speech is allowed, we're saying that you can use any word to, to attack somebody. So are we saying that you can use any derogatory term that you want? It's completely up to you. You can decide to say anything that you want to anybody at any time, in any place, regardless of the setting, because you need to have a line here. So in the business conference, in the meetings, in professional settings, are you allowed to speak to your colleagues in any way that you see fit? Are you allowed to use any words you want to? And if so, do you think that's fair? Do you think that's safe? Do you think that's a good precedent to set? That you can speak to anyone in any way that you see fit?
Shiri?
Yeah, my question is a follow-up on hers, which is, what do you think about a country where a government has no stance about what's right or wrong to talk? So, for example, why should a Jewish person feel comfortable living in the UK if, despite no physical violence, everyone can every day slander him or her and say, no, Jews should die, etc., etc.? I think a government should have a stance about what's right or wrong, and I'd like to hear their opinion.
Thank you. Can I allow Sartak to respond first to what Pratik has said? Sartak?
Thank you. I'll also touch on some of the topics discussed earlier in the debate, and not just what Pratik mentioned in his pretty long afterthought. Okay, so now that I have more time, I'll try to talk about 6 issues over here very quickly. The first one, he talked about the Google engineer. That's factually incorrect. That wasn't hate speech. He gave a research study. He cited that research study, said that there's a statistically significant impact, and that was a proper finding. It wasn't any kind of hate speech. So when you're raising examples of hate speech, at least I think this audience deserves a correct example of hate speech which is being silenced. Fine. So the second one was about Sadia, and also Pratik mentioned that hate speech doesn't lead to violence. So why do we need to stop that? But in fact, I again have some research findings with me. So in this, a political scientist from Harvard actually conducted a study in Rwanda, and he found out that just on the basis of hate speech being uttered by radio commentators, 9% of the deaths in the genocide which happened in Rwanda could be attributed to that. And 45,000 members of the community who died could again be attributed to people who died as a result of the hate speech. So you can't really say that hate speech doesn't lead to violence. So why to worry about that? And the third point over here is, okay, accept that. Sadia spoke that when hate speech leads to violence, let's then be concerned. Why do we be concerned beforehand? But I'd like to ask you something. Why do you take vaccines? Why don't you just get the disease and then go to the doctor and say, okay, cure me? You don't do that, right? You take vaccines because you want to stop that unwanted consequence from happening, which is exactly what we want to do. We have shown in the research that hate speech can lead to violence, and especially egregious kind of violence at that. So why do you want to permit a society? You talked about the benefits of hate speech. Again, you still didn't answer my question, which said that, all right, if Donald Trump says all Mexicans are rapists, what benefit to society is actually happening? Is society actually moving forward from that? I still did get an answer from that. You also spoke about hate speech being an opinion and not a fact. I'm sorry, but you didn't pay attention to the definition we raised, and you didn't even contradict that. Hate speech is, again, a public declaration against a particular group of people because of the caste, the religion, or the orientation they belong to, and that is something which is can be judged in fact. It's not an opinion. It's not that Charlie is a good man or a bad man. It's you're kind of accusing somebody because of the race they belong to. And finally, you spoke about impacting a particular group of individuals. I'm sorry, Pratik, but when we think of it, where do we find the hate speech? It happens when people of the majority class, people who are ruling the country, go out in the public, use their license to speak anything they want to utter this kind of hate speech. It doesn't impact only one people in that case. It impacts millions of people. So for instance, in India, if you have the chief minister of our most populous state going out in the public and saying something like, whenever the population of minorities, which obviously means Muslims by that, goes beyond 10%, then riots happen. So we don't want something like that to happen. I mean, this is actually impacting the 14 crore Muslims in India. I mean, it's not an isolated case. This is the powerful tool which hate speech actually is. You say one thing, it impacts millions of people and can wreak havoc with their life. So I really beg you to appreciate that hate speech is not an individual occurrence. It happens in groups, it happens in large groups. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sartak. Before we go to Sadia, can I have that one question from the floor? Two more questions from the floor.
Thank you. So I noticed that the proposition was focusing a lot on, people being offended and how subjective that is. So would the proposition be saying that there is no harm in hate speech whatsoever? So, there's no sense of, it leading to harms to LGBT people, psychological damage, stereotype threat, those sorts of things. Would they not count as harm? And would that not be a justifiable basis of limiting hate speech?
Thank you. There's two more hands from the floor. Three.
There's no question that hate speech is hurtful. It hurts your feelings, it makes you feel bad, it is unpleasant, it seems to undermine everything that you feel. However, there is no law that says we can't upset people. There is no law that says we can't offend people. And I would hate to live in a world where there were laws that said, I'm not allowed to say things that might hurt your feelings. I'm sorry, but your feelings are there, and if I want to hurt them, I will hurt them. That is a right that I have.
There is one question from this side of the room that's been very silent. Yeah, can we get that?
Hello, from this side of the room. I was just wondering if the opposition had any suggestions for how you'd counteract the negative ramifications for hate speech. Thank you.
All right. Before, can I allow proposition to... Oh, sorry, you didn't get your question.
How would the proposition suggest we counteract the negative ramifications of hate speech?
Right. Proposition, do you want to take that on as well?
I'd like you to look beyond Sarthak's ad hominem attacks on us and our way that we've argued this, and basically look beyond this idea of comparing hate speech to cancer, which is comparing apples and oranges. So about the question that we had, that the idea that hate speech, to what extent are you actually allowed to say whatever you want to say in this society? Are we promoting that? I think it was clear from our arguments that we do not like hate speech. We do not like the consequences it causes. However, our problem is, do we need to ban it? What words can be banned? What arguments should be banned? So for example, if you are being sexist in your office, no, that is not okay. We would never endorse that. But what we're saying is that we don't need to have the state censoring it or somebody being forcefully shut up because of their beliefs. As society has evolved, we have come to know so many words over time that have become politically incorrect without us having to pass laws to ban them. And what we are arguing is that when we have debates like these, when there is some critical point where a certain idea becomes so repulsive that society doesn't want to use that to promote whatever majority interest, that idea falls away itself. The more that we talk about these things, the more that we call them out, the more scope is to create the trust that Pratik was talking about, to create these norms that stop us from being hateful towards each other. The other question that I want to just address is the terrorism question. That yes, we do understand, and Femi also talked about that, somebody who was bullied in their childhood or somebody who was given so much hate as a child or growing up may come in their adult life to become radicalized and to do things that are horrible. Right? However, I've also seen in societies like mine in Pakistan that where a certain type of hate speech is allowed, say that is a very strange version of Islamic fundamentalist extremism, other types of speech that can balance the equation do not exist. So in Pakistan, for example, while it is easy for a religious man to say what he needs to say on a platform, if you have a liberal voice, if that voice is critiquing major religious parties, critiquing the military, for example, that voice is going to be shut out. So what we're saying is that with our argument that what type of hate speech are you going to ban, we don't want any types of extremists to be influencing our children. But we also want to make sure that things that have been defined as hate speech, for example, just criticizing religion in Pakistan or just criticizing the military in Pakistan, those things are also allowed so that we have some scope of balancing the scales when it comes to things like terrorism. And of course, with regards to your actions, if you have been bullied as a child, you may grow up to become a terrorist, but let us also remember that there may be many children who have grown up in that environment, but grow up to be good things, who grow up to become advocates and peace builders. We have to give some credit to human agency as well. Everything that happens to you and your actions at the end are not just because of what other people are doing to you, but also your own human agency. So the person who tried to blow up a plane himself is also to blame, regardless of his socialization and how he was impacted initially by hate speech. There's so many other elements that will act on you as a person.
Thank you, Sadia. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions. I'll prive you to this side of the room for now, because they haven't said anything as much. So 3 from this side.
Hello. Yeah, I have a point to make to the proposition. The basic contention that they have here is that the regulation of hate speech is very difficult. But my point is that there will always be censorship, and they've raised this point themselves, that the society ultimately pressurizes the people into not doing that. But my point is, eventually, isn't the society basically the majority? And when you allow the society to make the decisions on what is hate speech and what isn't, ultimately, doesn't the majority decide then that okay, this is hate speech and this isn't? And then isn't that stifling the voice of the minority even more?
Right, last 2 questions from this side of the room.
Thank you. I'm also interested in how you deal with the different definitions of hate speech in different countries. So I assume what is considered hate speech in the UK or let's say in Russia would be different. Thank you.
All right, last question.
I'm wondering about the blur of whether something is hateful or whether it is threatening, whether it is just plain rude. There's a big blur there, so I'm not sure where your ban would be. And the other thing is the blurring of the ban versus legal sort of arrest. If someone comes into a room full of Muslims and they're spouting a lot of Islamophobia, I'm going to get them to leave. Now, is that banning them? So to what extent are you saying something is banned, and what extent are you saying that you're just going to ignore or shun someone who is being rather nasty?
Okay, so proposition, opposition, who wants to go first? All right, opposition. Please try and answer the question, I think especially on who should regulate and who decides what is hate speech.
Okay, so there have been quite a number of questions. I didn't take them all down, but I think I see some trends, some themes here, and I'm going to try to address those themes. I think one of those themes is the issue of definitions. What really is hate speech, and who defines what hate speech is? Hate speech has already been defined. Now, maybe there are tiny differences here and there by different constitutions and different dictionaries, Oxford and Cambridge being the 2 that I checked up. But there is a pretty clear sense of what qualifies to be called hate speech and what doesn't. To one of the points raised about you having a right to say something hurtful. True, you do, but up to a point. So for instance, if you told me, Femi, I dislike your shoe, that's going to hurt my feelings, right? If you said, Femi, you're skinny, that hurts my feelings really bad. But that's not hate speech. Now, we're not saying that there won't be issues, and this is the second theme. We're not saying there won't be issues in ensuring that, there is it's prohibited or it's not acceptable in our society. There would be. There is no law that has not had its issues. What the proposition seems to be saying, and what a few people in the audience seem to be saying, is because it's difficult, let's give up. If the definitions are not clear-cut, let's define them. Let's define them appropriately. What is it we don't want? What is it that injures our societies? That's the point. Now, someone made a point about the fact that, hate speech causes violence, and we already have laws governing violence, so why do we need the duplication? And that sounds, on the surface, that sounds like a valid point. What that point ignores, though, is the fact that hate speech is itself violent. And this isn't about hurting my feelings. This is about the fact that while I'm vulnerable, whether I'm a child or I'm someone living with, some mental disability, you're destroying me. This isn't this isn't a play on emotions. So, if you're going to try to say that free speech must be had, free speech is what builds our societies. Our point is that if you do not control that free speech, you hurt it. If you don't set the boundaries, if you don't set the limits, you destroy that which you're trying to protect. That's the point we're making here. Is that unreasonable? Thank you.
Femi, you still didn't answer about who should regulate it. I think that was the biggest. That was the biggest question.
So
that
again,
was coming from
that
the
has a
floor.
nuanced answer. In democracies, who has the power to decide what happens? Presumably, it's the society. Right? It's the community. It's us. It's the majority. Now, we acknowledge that we live in a world where sometimes the majority is silenced itself, right? Where a few people make the choices for us. The issue then is not with the concept or the idea that hate speech should be prohibited. The issue is with the systems we live in. Let's not get it mixed up. We can make the same argument about almost every other law, right? Regulation of hate speech, and again, I think we need to make this clear. Regulation isn't going to solve the problem of hate speech. And I don't know if that's been mentioned, but I sense that that's going to be a response that I'm going to hear, that the law is imperfect. But regulation of hate speech is not going to be adequate. We need much more than that. We need communities that say it's unacceptable to say some things. Of course, it's very acceptable for you to say I'm too skinny. It's very acceptable to say my shoes are horrible. I think it's the societies. It's our societies. It's you and me, basically, is what I'm saying. I'm out of words, sorry.
All right. In the interest of time, we'll have to wrap up, but we'll have to redo the voting because I think some of you are persuaded for or against after the extension of the discussion. So can we do that now? Those in favor of the proposition, please raise your hands. Thank you. Those in favor of the opposition, please raise your hands. Thank you. Please note that I'm adding your votes with the Twitter poll. So your votes are counted along with the Twitter poll.
Well, the first thing I have to say is that this is a masterly exhibition of counting. I haven't seen anything so efficient. The votes are in for the motion. This House recognizes that hate hate speech is free speech, the audience have voted for the opposition with, you have here an overwhelming, I'm not too sure it's an overwhelming vote, 48 votes, 80% voted for the opposition. 80% voted for the proposition on Twitter. So can I just repeat that? The votes are in for the motion. This House recognizes that hate speech is free speech. The audience have voted for the opposition with an overwhelming 48 votes. 80% voted for the opposition on Twitter. As for me, I would just like to congratulate both teams on wonderful presentations of the points that you made. And this is a debate which will no doubt continue to go on. Not clear? Yeah?
Just confirming, did we win?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is a very great example of how debates should be conducted. And I wish that you had some influence in the larger political arena about how you did this. I've been given 2 quotations here about it, but before I read them, can I just say that for myself, I've always felt that this word freedom and things like any sentence with the word free in it is capable of so much misunderstanding. For me, philosophically, freedom and the very concept of freedom implies that we set some limits. You can't be entirely free in any society unless there are some limitations to what that concept means and what it's all about. And I've been given 2 quotations here, one from Winston Churchill, which says, "After all, everyone is in favor of free speech. Hardly a day passes without it being extolled. But some people's idea of it is that they are free to say what they like. But if anyone else says anything back, then that is considered an outrage." And that's Churchill. And then George Orwell said, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." So there we are, things that you can take and mull over yourselves. Again, congratulations, and congratulations on that expert counting. I haven't seen anything quite like it since the Brexit vote. But no, I'm not making any imputations about the Brexit vote, please. But thank you very much, and I've really enjoyed this. Thank you for inviting me here, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you, Sir Trevor. With that, on behalf of the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Trust, I would like to thank everyone again for making the time to come this evening. Have a good night.